Today we celebrate the Solemnity of Christ the King. We think about the kingdom of God. And the language of the kingdom of God is very present throughout the scriptures. It was quite controversial at the time of Jesus to refer to Jesus as a king, because there was already a king. It was a Jewish king, King Herod. And then there was an emperor, and the whole world as it was known at the time, at least the Roman Empire, considered itself the whole world. So they were already part of a kingdom or an empire already. So to refer to Jesus as a king was controversial. Jesus, moments before he dies, when he's at Calvary, he's with Pontius Pilate, they place a crown on his head. And he interacts with Pontius Pilate. He says, "Are you a king?" He said, "Well, my kingdom's not of this world." But he said, "Yes, I am a king." Jesus is definitely a king. And our readings today remind us of the sort of kingdom that we're called to create. We're not called to go to fight with clubs and swords for this kingdom. But we are definitely called to work for this kingdom, right here and now. Part of the commitment of being a Christian is to be a person of prayer. That's what we do on a Sunday morning. We worship. But one of the other commitments of becoming a Christian is to participate and live as part of God's kingdom. And we do that, as the first reading of the gospel reminds us, we do that through charity. We do that through feeding those who are hungry, clothing the naked, visiting the sick, visiting those who've been isolated and sent away from communities. This is not just something we do anonymously, we do this personally. And Jesus wants us to know those who are sick, those who are in prison, those who are isolated, those who are hungry. Not just to give them a handout to an anonymous person we've never seen, but to know them, to love them, and to give them dignity. And that's part of what we all are called to do in our own specific, our own personal way. So I think one of the questions for ourselves today is, how are we living charity? What charities are we doing? Within our parish, there are many people who are doing charities on a parish level, involved in St Vincent de Paul, or our work with Care and Concern, or the church's work with catechist work. That's charity work as well. Or with our social justice group, our connection with people in Timor-Leste and other things. But all of us are called to charity. So what are you doing in your own personal way to be a person of charity? In your home context, your own streets, your own neighbourhood. Part of being a Christian is not just to pray, but we absolutely need to pray. But we also need to do charity. We're called to be the hands of Christ in our world. Saint Mother Teresa of Calcutta said that every day she would come to church to pray. She'd spend an hour in adoration looking at Jesus in the monstrance, in the Blessed Sacrament. She would look at Jesus, then she would receive Jesus in Holy Communion during Mass. And then she would go into India, in the streets of Calcutta, and she would go to serve Jesus, to find Jesus in the poor, the sick, the lonely. And we're called to do this as well, in our own particular way. Where do we find Jesus? We should find Jesus here in Mass. But when we go from this place, we should be looking to discover Jesus and to serve Jesus in our community as well. It's quite interesting. This feast day is a relatively new feast in the life of the church. Some feasts date back from the 2nd or the 3rd century. But this feast actually dates from 1925. Pope Pius XI instituted this feast at the end of October, and then in the 1960s got moved to the end of our liturgical year, as a sort of a longing for God's kingdom in eternity, in heaven. Pope Pius XI instituted this feast just after World War I, because he could see something was happening in the world. And I think the reasons why Pope Pius XI instituted this feast, perhaps some of those reasons still exist even today. After World War I and directly before World War I as well, there was a movement of boundaries of different countries. And ideas of different nationhood was starting to change. People who'd previously been part of of perhaps Austria were now part of Germany or part of Poland. People who were part of Germany suddenly became part of Italy, and there was sort of all of these different boundaries which changing people's identity. And Pope Pius XI saw that nationalism, even though perhaps it's a good thing for people to work together, nationalism can sometimes lead to a racism, whereby we only look after those within our own backyard and we don't see that God's kingdom extends right across the entire world. And so Pope Pius XI instituted this feast so that Catholics right across the whole world will gather towards the end of the year, just before we head on the journey towards Christmas, to know that our identity is not just in our own nationhood, in the badge or the flag that we fly for our own country, but that we are human beings. We are brothers and sisters right across the entire world, and that we're called to live that God's kingdom, that way of charity, today right across the entire world. What's happened over the last 9 months, what we're continuing to see is an isolationism, which has been forced on us because of COVID. However, as soon as the vaccine comes and other efforts are made, we should do our very best to reaffirm the fact that we are global citizens. That we're not just looking after those who are in Cronulla or those in New South Wales or those in Queensland if people are watching from up there. That we are part of a global community. God's kingdom is not just here in this little place. God's kingdom is the whole world, and we're called to serve each and every person. Those we might see down the street here, who are poor, who are without food. But we should be doing what we can to assist those who are hungry and need in other parts of the world as well. Those who are sick, those who are in prison. God's kingdom is not just the kingdom in Australia. It's not just this Commonwealth. It's not just a particular national identity. This celebration of Christ the King reminds us we are human beings, and that the love of Jesus Christ doesn't discriminate. It doesn't just look after a particular race of people or people from a particular place. The love of Jesus Christ extends to everyone. So let us today commit on this feast of Christ the King to being people of prayer, but also being people of charity. To pray and to do charity not just for those who we know in our own local community, but reaching out to those beyond our community right across the entire world.